Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlock Holmes scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by listeners like you who choose to support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Find out more at patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the lip was twisted, the soldier was blanched, and the men were dancing, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about whatever happened to Inspector Gregson? Or Mrs. Hudson's husband? Or of Holmes's early clients?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 362, Hand Washing. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the detail in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
Burt, are you all scrubbed and ready to go?
Yes, I'm wearing my scrubs, actually, matching green bottom and top, and my surgical gown. I like to be ready for any emergency. I've got my stethoscope with me.
Excellent. Doc Wolder at your service.
Yes. And all I did this morning was cut the grass. Boy, oh boy.
Well, this is the last in our series of monthly observances here on Trifles. Of course, it is the first show of December, and December is National Hand Washing Awareness Month. Don't ask me. I don't make this stuff up. I just pick it off the internet. But it did suggest to us that we ought to look into hygiene, specifically manual hygiene in the canon. So we will have a look through some instances of hand washing accoutrement, and other associated hygienic tasks here on episode 362. If you would like the show notes for this episode, they are available through our website, SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. You can also check out all of our social links at our Linktree link there. It is Linktree/I Hear of Sherlock. It's available in the show notes. And you can also find out how to become a member of our Patreon community. All of our Patreon members are part of a community. They all have the opportunity to listen to the show ad-free, and at the end of every month, you're automatically entered into a drawing for a free back issue of the Baker Street Journal. And at the end of the quarter, you're entered into a contest for a drawing for an annual subscription to the Baker Street Journal. Well worth the chance of becoming an annual subscriber simply by becoming a patron for as little as $1 a month. All right, Burt. Well, it's interesting that we should be talking about hand washing in a series that is narrated and written by a physician. You would expect that these individuals would be of the most hygienic sorts around. And Watson himself starts out the canon with a mention of hand washing, although it is merely a figure of speech. It's not the actual hand washing. So where should we begin with our discussion of hand washing?
You could actually begin with the earliest engagement we have between Holmes and Watson, and in fact, it's even Watson pre-Holmes, because what happens, of course, is Dr. Watson is beginning his memoir, and we're reading about his lonely experience, his short, very short of funds in London, and he bumps into Stamford, and what happens is Stamford introduces the idea of him meeting up with Sherlock Holmes, who also needs a room in London, but he's got some things to say about Holmes. And then Watson turns to him and says, well, if we don't get on, it'll be easy enough to end all that. And then he says to Stamford, looking hard like Paddington. He got a hard stare at Stamford. He says, it seems to me you have some reason for washing your hands of the matter. Is this fellow's temper so formidable, or what is it? Don't be mealy-mouthed about it. So Watson is a little grumpy here.
Well, as many have intuited, it may be New Year's Day, and Watson may be a little hungover, so maybe a little more terse in his approach. So yeah, I mean, he literally wanted Stamford to own up to any foibles that he may know about with regard to Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, but here it is in the 1880s, and we have this metaphor of washing your hands, sort of for getting rid of something.
Yeah.
And then later on in Study in Scarlet, when we get into the actual case, we'll find at the murder scene some evidence of hand washing, because as Lestrade tells us what he particularly finds in the room, he says, the villain must have stayed in the room some little time after the murder, for we found blood-stained water in the basin where he had washed his hands.
Yeah, and obviously I think the criminal, which in this case was Jefferson Hope, was looking to conceal his crime. Wasn't necessarily something in terms of hygienic cleanliness. It was more about visual cleanliness, because you're walking around with blood-stained hands. Well, people are going to pick you out of a crowd. Not the most conspicuous way to go about it. But as this relates to Watson and Watson's profession, I wondered about hand washing in medicine, and I know Maimonides in the 12th century recognized the need for hand washing for good hygiene in medicine as early as I think it was 1199. And he began to wash his hands after handling a sick person, or dismounting from his horse, or treating patients. But you get all the way up to the mid-1800s, and mid to late 1800s, really, and surgeons were not regularly washing their hands before operating on patients. And they were unknowingly spreading bacteria between, they'd finish the surgery and they'd have these heavy gloves on. They'd wipe them on their apron, and then they'd go off and they'd operate on the next person. They certainly wouldn't change gloves. They weren't disposable the way they are today. And you'd be reinfecting other patients. So there was very little consistency or attention to detail when it comes to this. And it was thanks to the invention of Joseph Lister, who lived between 1827 and 1912, where he applied germ theory to surgery, and he had an antiseptic system that was the basis for modern infection control.
Well, and this, it continues today. I mean, in addition to Joseph Lister, the leading light, I think, for hand washing was, sort of in the middle of the 19th century by a doctor named Semmelweis, who I think was a Hungarian, who began popularizing it. But today, there's a wonderful doctor and writer, Atul Gawande, who observed in the care. Now I'm trying to bring back to my memory the details, but the gist of it is his father. He's a physician himself, and his father's particular care. He observed a lot of it, and he realized that there was a great lack of checklists for following real basic sanitary procedures or basic physician sanitary practices. And he's written about this, and today, particularly post-COVID, happily, I think there's a far greater adherence to gloves and sanitary practices than had been more casual before.
Yeah. And the thing is, it was known. They just didn't know how to prevent it. There's a great quote from Sir James Young Simpson, who was a surgeon and professor of medicine and midwifery. The quote from him in the 1860s, where he said, "A man laid on the operating table in one of our surgical hospitals is exposed to more chance of death than was the English soldier on the field of Waterloo." So take that, Napoleon. So, but it's not only physicians that are aware of the importance of hand washing and of general cleanliness. It's also mothers everywhere. And a great example of this is Mrs. Smith, the wife of the captain of the steamship Aurora. Remember, Holmes and Watson went down to the docks and were inquiring about the Aurora, and Holmes approached the door of their house, and when it opened, a little curly-headed lad of 6 came running out, followed by a stoutish, red-faced woman with a large sponge in her hand. "You come back and be washed, Jack," she shouted. "Come back, you young imp, for if your father comes home and finds you like that, he'll let us hear of it."
Well, that's great. I always miss that. Yeah, another lovely little touch of verisimilitude that makes these stories so special.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about the individual in the canon who was most in need of a good washing.
Well, by intent, he didn't want to be washed at all, of course. And this is the beggar man Hugh Boone from The Twisted Lip, who's in custody, suspected of doing away with Neville St. Clair. And of course, people comment, the police comment, we've got him in the cells, but boy, he is a dirty scoundrel. It's all we can do to make him wash his hands. And his face is as black as a tinker's. Well, we soon find out why that was.
Spoiler alert, right? Holmes walks in with a Gladstone bag, and he takes out a huge sponge. And the inspector's like, "You're funny." but Holmes goes, "Oh, open the door quietly, and we'll see if we can clean him up." And he slipped his key into the lock. They quietly entered the cell. Hugh Boone turned, and Holmes stooped to the water jug, moistened his sponge, rubbed it twice vigorously across the prisoner's face. And then there's that wonderful line, "Let me introduce you," he shouted, "to Mr. Neville St. Clair of Lee in the county of Kent." Voila. Well, it's not only humans that need to wash their extremities, is it?
No, and it's another one of these great magic tricks, like the instant reveal of Neville St. Clair in Silver Blaze, when the race is done and the colonel is, still sort of completely at a loss.
Colonel Ross, right?
Colonel Ross, right. And Holmes says, "Well, here he is," but the horse is completely unrecognizable. And Holmes says, "You have only to wash his face and his leg in spirits of wine, and you will find he is the same old Silver Blaze as ever." You take my breath away.
That's great. Well, there is physical evidence of people's cleanliness habits in the resident patient. Of course,
yes.
in those days, we didn't have ensuite water closets or restrooms, but what you would have was a stand where you would have a basin and a jug of water, and you would wash your hands there. And in the resident patient, they note that they found a screwdriver and some screws on the wash hand stand. So that's what then led Holmes to infer what he did about the hanging of Blessington there in that room.
Yes, yes. And then that's followed by the wonderful non-sanitary line, "Here are 4 cigar ends that I picked out of the fireplace." Oh, really? I don't think I'll shake your hand right now, if you don't mind, Mr. Holmes.
Thankfully, we have a wash basin right here.
How interesting for you.
Oh, that's great.
One of your cuticles, Mr. Holmes, is still smoldering.
And then looking at the Mazarin stone, there's a wonderful character study here, something that tells us something about the effete snobbery of Count Silvius Negretto. Which, by the way,
Silvius,
is,
I think. Yeah.
Oh, Count Negretto Silvius. Yeah. That's right. Which is, I believe that's Italian Silvius or Latin Negretto. For Black Forest, is it not?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, right. Yeah. Should be, yeah.
But he's there with his Confederate in 221B Baker Street, and his I don't know if it's him or his Confederate says, "Let's have a look at it," referring to the diamond that he's carrying with him. And Count Silvius cast a somewhat unflattering glance at his associate and disregarded the unwashed hand which was extended toward him. And then his Confederate says, "Well, what do you think? I'm going to snatch it off you? See here, mister, I'm getting a bit tired of your ways."
Yes, but I think I'll keep it in my pocket anyway.
You can just see him looking down his nose at him and almost wrinkling it as this unwashed hand comes toward him. Remarkable. Well, why don't we take a quick break here, and when we come back, we will finish it up with some more general hygiene habits on National Hand Washing Month. Stay tuned. We're now in the 4th quarter of the year, and the Baker Street Journal is going as strong as ever under editor Dan Andriacco. We've just seen the cover for the autumn issue, and it is a doozy. Full-color rendering of Professor Moriarty's head and shoulders from Sidney Paget's famous illustration. Now, that's not to say the professor had dandruff. Far from it with his bald pate. But we see the details of Paget's genius close up. And that's what the Baker Street Journal allows us to do with all kinds of scholarship and creative writing. To focus on the details of some aspect or another of Sherlock Holmes and his world. Just like we do here on Trifles. If you haven't gotten a subscription for 2023, it's not too late. You can still subscribe, get all of the issues to date, and be signed up for the Christmas annual. Just go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and subscribe to the BSJ today. We are back, and cleanliness is next to godliness, as they say. I don't know where that saying came from, do you?
No, a book. It came from a book. I've got it here on my shelf somewhere. It's one of these.
Yeah, I think it was, here we go, John Wesley.
Oh, right.
He's in a Universal Life Church sermon over 2 centuries ago.
Yeah, he's a great font for all these pithy observations, Jeeves.
He thought that if you could wash your hands, that meant your soul was clean as well. And not necessarily the case.
Well, these sorts of sanitary practices, too, and customs, did adhere to various, procedures in faith. I mean, there are lots of rituals in various religions that involve washing your hands before a meal or during a particular ceremony or so on. And then, of course, there's, baptism and a very large number of other related kinds of things.
Yeah, and for Catholics among us, it is part of the Mass, the whole hand washing portion of the Mass, and it is literal cleansing. And the priest says, "Wash away my iniquity and cleanse me from my sins," as he washes his hands in water. So interesting there. Well, let's turn to more broad hygiene as people were getting prepped to start their day, washing your face and washing your hands and everything. These are things that we all do in the morning, and when they are not done, well, they send a signal Holmes's way. And where do we find our beloved Watson talking about his ablutions, shall we say?
Well, that's in The Three Students, where, they're already engaged in this particular matter, and Watson has left Holmes lost in thought after dinner. And then at 8 in the morning, Watson says, "He came into my room just as I finished my toilet."
Well, I say, Holmes, you're just in time. No, it's not that kind of toilet, is it?
No. It's, again, you mentioned earlier, the washstand and so on. And this is, probably brushing one's hair, certainly putting on one's clothing, probably shaving, all of these things. And in fact, that's one of the lovely things they did so nicely in the Jeremy Brett series. There are these scenes where someone is coming into Baker Street, and in a great hurry, Holmes, rushes around the room, throws some things, puts his jacket on, And you could say that's sort of finishing your toilet. But here, Watson's clearly just gotten up, and Holmes has come to call, and worse, Holmes says, "Look, we've got to get down to St. Luke's. Can you do without breakfast?"
Yeah, breakfast is one thing, but, those morning ablutions are another. There was, I think it was in one of the early stories, Boscombe Valley Mystery, here it is, where Holmes looks at Watson and he says, I perceive that in your bedroom, the window is upon the right-hand side, and yet I question whether Mr. Lestrade would have noted so self-evident a thing as that. Watson says, "Well, how on earth? Oh, my dear fellow, I know you well. I know the military neatness which characterizes you. You shave every morning. And in this season, you shave by the sunlight. But since your shaving is less and less complete as we get farther back on the left side, till it becomes positively slovenly as we get round the angle of the jaw, it's surely very clear that that side is less illuminated than the other."
Lovely bit of deduction there.
Yeah.
Well, and then in The Dying Detective, after Holmes's great tribulations, he is restoring himself. And at the end of it all, Holmes says, as he's having a glass of claret and some biscuits, "I never needed it more." And he's drinking a little claret and eating his biscuits, as Watson says, in the intervals of his toilet. So as he's cleaning himself up and brushing his hair and washing his face, he's having a little claret and biscuits. "However, as you know, my habits are irregular, and such a feat means less to me than to most men."
Yeah.
But still, Watson has told us before that he, is as neat as a cat about certain
That's things. Right. That's right. And he does not snack while on the throne. That's just to be clear about the terminology here. And there is an instance where Holmes gets a client, and the client's appearance sets Holmes off. In Wisteria Lodge, Mr. John Scott Eccles arrives, and Holmes says, "Well, why didn't you come see me at once?" "What do you mean?" And Holmes looks at his watch. He says, "Well, it's 2:15. Your telegram was dispatched about 1. But no one can glance at your toilet and attire without seeing that your disturbance dates from the moment of your waking." And Eccles says, "Well, you're right, Mr. Holmes. I never gave a thought to my toilet. I was only too glad to get out of such a house." So there's an instance of someone just waking, and we know he woke late and was alarmed and just grabbed his things and left. Didn't take the opportunity to clean himself up the way he normally would.
Another great deduction.
Yeah. And that's reminiscent, I think, of the appearance of Thornycroft Huxtable, where Holmes looks at his chin and deduces that he didn't do his usual toilet that morning either.
Yes.
So, well, instances, one and all, of people paying great heed, or in some cases not, to these trifling habits of hand washing and toilet. And I suppose that's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.